To start filing into the Zoom room before we get started. So today I'm very excited about today's presentation. So today's textile talk, we have the Quilt Index, and it is all about preserving images and stories about quilts and their makers. And it is presented by the Modern Quilt Guild today. Looks like people are still coming in. So I'll give you a few more moments. Now it looks like we have people joining from across the country, from Brooklyn and Lincoln, Massachusetts. Oh, Vancouver. Awesome. Thank you all so much for being here today. We've got somebody here from the UK and Portugal. Oh, this is fantastic. We've got a worldwide affair today. Wonderful. Thank you all so much for being here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started and introduce our presentation for the day. Please keep putting in hellos from where you're from in the chat box. We love to see that. So hello, everyone. Today's textile talks is all about the Quilt Index, where it is focused on preserving images and stories about quilts and their makers. Today's presentation is presented by the Modern Quilt Guild. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Brenna. I'm the communications manager for the Modern Quilt Guild. And today I am joined by Marsha MacDowell and Beth Donaldson. Before we get started on the presentation, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping about Zoom. So if you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, please send me a note in the Q&A box and I can chat with you to find a solution. It's always an option to close out of your Zoom and click on the link again. We'll still be here. We'll still be talking about the Quilt Index, and this will be recorded. So if you miss a minute, you'll be able to catch it in the recording. The recording will be added to the Modern Quilt Guild's resource page along with SAQUA's website. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions, please do put those in the Q&A box. And just as a general reminder, we respectfully ask you to be courteous as you engage with the speakers, moderators, and other participants. Please use the Q&A box for questions. Please use the chat box for greetings. And if the survey for commentary or any other ways that we can improve these presentations. If you prefer not to see notifications from chat, you can click on the chat button to toggle them on or off if you find that distracting. So for those of you who are new to Textile Talks, this is a series of free weekly presentations and panel discussions from fiber art organizations, including the International Quilt Museum, Quilt Alliance, San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, Studio Art Quilt Associates, Surface Design Association, and us at the Modern Quilt Guild. As you can see from the slide, we have wonderful sponsors that help bring you the textile talks. We have Aurifil, Artistic Artifacts, C&T Publishing, Empty Spools, Seminars, eQuilter.com, Handy Quilter, Misty Fuse, Moda Fabrics and Supplies, 9 Patch Fabrics, Quiltmania, Schiffer Publishing, and thequiltshow.com. So now that the housekeeping is out of the way, I would love to introduce you to Marsha and Beth. Marsha MacDowell is a Ph.D. She is a professor and curator of folk arts and quilt studies at Michigan State University. She is the director of the Quilt Index, and she has authored numerous publications on quilt history. Beth Donaldson has been a quilt maker for over 40 years and has authored 4 publications on quilting and is the associate director of the Quilt Index. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so Beth and Marsha can unmute themselves and share Beth's screen. And I'm going to go away until the Q&A session at the end. So I will let Marsha take it away.
Well, first of all, I just have to say, wow, we had no idea how many people attend these and how spread out around the world you all are. So I'm just thrilled that we can reach so many today. And let me start out by saying thank you, big thank you to the Modern Quilt Guild for being the host of this textile talk, and to all 6 organizations which are presenting and promoting the textile talks. I think these are just terrific. I've listened to a couple of them myself, and I think it's just wonderful how all of this information sharing is happening. And we really are pleased to have this time to provide you all with an introduction to the Quilt Index. It's just such a remarkable, freely accessible online resource for research and education. And as I was sharing before we actually officially started, Beth and I have individually done a couple of presentations on introducing people to the Quilt Index. We've never done it together, so you all are in for a dynamic, maybe unexpected conversations as we remotely do this. And so with that, let me just give you a brief overview. How we're going to work today is that I'm going to say a few things about what the index is and what its history and its goals are. And then we'll go right to Beth, who will make a dynamic screen sharing happen, that she will be in real time walking you through the Quilt Index and all of its features and its tools and its resources. And since Beth has said she can talk about this for 3 hours, I've already talked about the index for 3 hours. We're condensing this today to what we can achieve in 1 hour. So we hope that, maybe if there are a lot of questions about a certain aspect of the Quilt Index, we'll come back and do a deeper dive into things. So basically then, what the Quilt Index is an open source digital repository of thousands of images, stories, and information about quilts and their makers, drawn from hundreds of public and private collections around the world. And this dispersed collection feature is one of the brilliant aspects of the Quilt Index. You will be able to see across collections, even though they're geographically dispersed, these quilts, the images, and the stories. It also represents the work of thousands of community-based and independent scholars, digital humanists, and professionals in libraries, archives, and museums who are dedicated to preserving and making quilt history accessible. So I'm already doing an impromptu thing. Beth, can you go to the About page and history? Project history, yeah.
Our history?
Right, perfect. So already, this point in the Quilt Index is where you can investigate a lot more about the history of the project, but I will just give you a brief summary of why it was created, how it has developed to date, and where we're going. So this is more the philosophical history of it. The last quarter of the 20th century saw, of course, an explosion of interest in documenting, exhibiting, and collecting quilts and their stories. And by the early 1990s, it had become evident to many individuals that a centralized repository for quilt-related information would help advance preservation of information and access to the growing grassroots and scholarly documentation that was emerging. So in 1995, a newly formed Alliance for American Quilts organization began incubating steps that would enable the planning and construction of a hub for quilt information. And in doing so, began to work with Michigan State University. Importantly, Michigan State University had two key partners, Matrix, the Center for Digital Humanities and Social Sciences, and the Michigan State University Museum. Matrix brought to the table digital repository design and implementation expertise, and the MSU Museum brought curatorial staff with quilt studies expertise, as well as two MSU Museum owned collections. One, the records of the state documentation project, or the Michigan Quilt Project, and also a substantial collection of actual quilts. So with an initial grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and after a couple of years of developing and testing, the Quilt Index was launched in 2003 with images and data on just under 2,000 quilts, drawn from just 4 institutions, and with an emphasis at that time on the records of statewide quilt documentation projects. As of today, we have over 85,000 quilts in the index, and will likely have over 100,000 quilts records by the end of this year. So since 2003, when it was formally launched, we have had several distinct goals. One is we want to keep increasing the content of data within the index, and importantly, within that increase, make sure that we are attending to under-researched areas of quilt history, especially among communities that did not have their quilt history well recorded. We also want to create tools that makes it easier for discovering and using information in what is essentially this big data set. And then thirdly, importantly, we're working towards long-term sustainability. So in a minute, Beth will start leading a demonstration of the many tools and resources in the index, but I think this grounding of where this resource came from and what it's attempting to do will help you understand where we're going, and will help you understand some of the things pertaining to the particular resources that we have in the index. So we hope that this introduction will entice you to explore the index if you have not already done so for your own interests, be it for research, education, or simply inspiration. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Beth, and intermittently I'll make some commentary, but we're now in Beth's hands.
Okay, thank you, Marsha, and thanks everybody for coming. And I want to ditto everything Marsha said, but let's just jump in because everybody wants to see quilts. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go across the menu and jump around and show you some of the different things. Some of you that were used to the old Quilt Index, it looks new and it's now relational, so things hook to each other. So the first page is the quilts. And the interesting thing in this is the submenu. So we have featured quilts, which is something you can choose to, that quilt is special, you want it on the featured page. New are just quilts that have recently been entered. Time period allows you to search by group time, so that you can go and look at all of the quilts that were from 1800 to 1849. When you get to the page, you'll see a load more. And when you click that, you just get more. And the cool thing about it is you can also sort. And you'll find the sort feature on many pages. So you can sort by maker, by pattern, or by date. And so if we go pattern Z to A, we're going to see all the W's first, the T's. So that's something that's, when you have 85,000 quilts, the question is, how do you find what you want? And so the sort is going to help you find what you want. The other interesting feature is the compare. And if you see these little white buttons, you just click on those. Then you can click compare. And only the ones that you clicked on show up. Now more are showing up because I had a bunch that I clicked on that are still in there being compared. So if I want to clear, I just go clear selected quilts, and now there won't be any to compare. The other thing I want to show you is location. So this is going to give where the quilt was made, and it's going to cover all the different projects that are in the Quilt Index. And it's also going to cover the different countries that we have quilts from. And then the last,
can I just interject here? So just as a note, when you are searching things, you know, by a pattern name or a location name, you always have to remember that thousands of quilts documented in the state documentation, quilt documentation projects were done by volunteers. And sometimes the information that was recorded was not always accurate. It might have been a wild guess about a date or the name of a quilt. And also whatever the person who owned the quilt or made the quilt told us might also have been faulty. So we always want to remind people that this is a starting point for research and that there are still investigations that need to happen after you have done your preliminary work within this context. Thanks.
And we don't go in and correct records. This is a repository. And the reason why we don't is because we might get it wrong, especially when it comes to a pattern name, because I may know it as something in Michigan, but the person that entered a name that's unknown to me, that's correct, maybe where they live. So we have to be very careful not to prejudge. So I was clicking through while Marsha was talking so that you could see these are all Maryland quilts and they're all sorted by the maker's name. Now the last is pattern name. And what I'm looking at now, these are pre-searched for you. So there's also a search page where you can do all these searches yourself. But the pattern name is specific to patterns that are pretty common in quilting. And if you look at, let's go to 9-patch. So what it's going to do is it's going to find all the 9 patches that are spelled like that, plus it's going to find the 9 patches that have the numeral 9, and it's going to find it if there's a space in between or if there's a dash in between. And so that's going to help us find these common patterns that have slight variations of names. So let's go on to the stories. And the stories is new, and we're gleaning these out of records that have already been documented, but some of the stories themselves are new. And why? Oh, it's acting a little slow. One of the things about the stories that's so good is there's a lot of stories about quilt making or quilt giving that isn't about a specific quilt. So for instance, we have the Star Quilt Thank You ceremony. And this was something that Marsha and Marsha discovered when we were researching quilts and health. And so this is a story about a group of quilts, not just one quilt. And so it doesn't really fit in a category of a single quilt. So a story is a good place. Basically, what I do is I go through old records and I try and find quilts that have compelling stories already, and then highlight that story by putting it in our story portal. The next thing are artists. And the artists.
Before you leave there, I'm just going to say that this is the fact that there's quilts, stories, and artists is a really different way of presenting this than was presented in the original version of the Quilt Index, because it was so focused on the object that we lost track of the stories. And this is wonderful to be able to tease out the stories. And the next thing that Beth is showing you, the information about the artist.
The other thing is that this is now a relational database. Everything before was flat, which meant all of the artist information had to go on every single quilt where the artist was featured. So now what we've done is you can have a page and then it can link to all of your quilts. So I'm going to go to me. There I am. And that's me pre-COVID when I could get a haircut. So now when you see my page, there's going to be room for a biography about me. And then once it loads up, you're going to see that my page links to all of my quilts. And not only does it link to the quilts I've made, but it links to all the quilts that I own because I have a collection of inexpensive eBay finds.
And while you're on there, Beth, can you show some of the kinds of questions that, I mean, for people who've never seen the Quilt Index, like the kinds of questions too?
Here?
Yeah, yeah.
So basically, we want to know everything we can about you as a quilt maker. So we want to know where you lived, where you grew up, are you married, do you have kids? Just basically biographical questions, ethnic background, urban or rural, that kind of thing. So when you look at my page, you can see that I have quilts that are in the MSU Museum. I also have quilts that were documented in the Michigan Quilt Project. I have put in newspaper clippings that I own. And then where it says Creator, those are all quilts that I've made. So we're going to load more, see more quilts that I've made. And as you go through the Quilt Index, you're going to find that it's really heavy on MSU Museum stuff because that's access to the records that I had. And I didn't have to get extra permissions. So I used all the MSU Museum stuff to make sure that all the connections were working and that all of the pages we were trying to create could be done. So now if you look, there's owner. So you can see the quilts that I have collected as well as the quilts that I've made. And the really cool thing about this is that you can, once I give a quilt away, it's still connected to me in the Quilt Index. So there's still a history of how my quilt collection grew and shrank and changed. So now let's go to the collections. And the collections is really the heart of the Quilt Index because it started with all those documentation projects. I don't know how many people out there worked on quilt documenting, but I have worked on documentation days and documented literally thousands of quilts. And I put all that data into the old Quilt Index. And now we're trying to manipulate the data in the new Quilt Index. So I have a rich background in the documentation. And what's really important to me is that we respect all of the thousands of mostly women that came to these days and did all this quilt documenting and all this photography. So what you're seeing here are the different statewide documentation projects.
Yeah, hold there. Just go back to the California one, because we've started to put in placeholders for state documentation or other regional, national documentation projects where we know it existed, but we're just alerting people that those records still need to get into the Quilt Index. So there you go.
So these are just the different records that go to documentation projects. And so let's look at Massachusetts. And they write their own description of what they did. And then one of the things I've been doing is I've been going through and I've been gleaning the museum collections that are in these documentation projects. So these are links to all the different museums that are in Massachusetts that have quilts in the Massachusetts Quilt Project. And so if you click on that or you click here, it will take you to that museum's page, which will take you to those quilts. But if we look at view all the records in this project, we're also going to see all of the records that Massachusetts has documented. And they've documented
whether they're from museums or private collections.
Right. And they've documented over 7,000. So again, you can use the compare tool and you can use the sort by to help you find what you're looking for in that collection. So also in collections, we have museums and we have legacy projects. So, and special collections. Now, a special collection is going to be a subset of one of the projects. So for instance, you're going to find a lot of special collections from the MSU Museum because again, I knew what those were. I had access to the data and the images. So I've been going back through and I've been gleaning other special collections. So in Arizona, they have a subset that were their Centennial Quilt Project. So you can go and see all those. The Artist and Robert James collection, which are the quilts that started the International Quilt Museum. And so if anybody knows of a special collection that they want me to create a page for, you can just email me, and that's on the contact page of the Quilt Index. The D.L. Miller quilt collection is interesting. This is Arizona quilts, and they're all owned by Lynn Miller, who heads up the Arizona Quilt Project, and she loves kids' quilts. So she has a really great collection.
So this gives you insight into collectors too, when you can see them all together like this.
And that gives her a chance to see all of her quilts in one place. And she owns over 1,000, I believe. So it's a substantial collection.
Beth, this is a good page to do some compare and contrast. I mean, because it looks like some similar imagery. Yeah, like those two right there.
So those are puppies. There's more puppies.
Yeah.
And then if I want to compare them, I can also redo the order. So these, now that I look at them side by side, they look all like the same pattern, don't they?
And then you show how you can blow them up too, right there.
Well, you can go to the whole record, but you can also look at it bigger. And Lynn has put a watermark on all her quilts.
So that's another important bit of information for people, that everything that goes into the Quilt Index is actually owned by the person who contributed it, whether it's an individual or a museum. So in order to get permission to use these images, which by the way are uploaded at a lower resolution, you have to go back to the museum or to the owner.
And since a lot of these records are over 30 years old, chances are the owner information isn't relevant anymore.
And we don't list details about individuals' personal addresses, just their name.
No, and I've had occasions where somebody has said, oh, I don't want my maiden name listed there. And so I just go in and take it out. So I'm going to let Marsha talk a little bit about legacy projects.
Yeah, so here is a notion, this is actually part of our sustainability plan, is that, and it is based on the idea that, like Beth, who has not only made quilts, but collected quilts, and she's actually given a lot of quilts away. My granddaughter is privy to one of those wonderful quilts that was made by Beth and a colleague when our granddaughter was born. So that's no longer in her physical possession, but it exists. Well, a quilt legacy project is a way to celebrate an individual's life in quilts. And Beth will eventually have one of these pages herself. But the idea came about because Claire Vlassen, who is pictured there holding up the quilt, Claire was one of my neighbors. Her husband and I were outside shortly after, we were at the mailbox, shortly after Claire passed away. And Claire was an active member of the American Quilt Study Group. She was active in her guilds. She had 5 children. She made tons of quilts. She had a beautiful installation of a quilt storage cabinet based on the dimensions and the style of the Michigan State University rolled quilt storage system. And as Ray and I talked, you know, he was mourning his wife, the loss of his wife, and he said, I just wish there was some way I could celebrate her life. And as we stood there, we concocted this idea of, well, we could actually preserve Claire's life in quilts in a digital way by engaging her offspring to document the quilts that she made and had given them, they could send it all to us, and then we could also help Ray in documenting the quilts that were part of her own collection, and therefore present it all along with a little biography written by Ray and reviewed by family members, and then extending also into finding out if there are any other resources about her. And as it turns out, there were some photographs that were owned by fellow Quilt Guild members of Claire, and even a tape recorded interview with her. And so we were able to aggregate all of that together and put it all in one place, and thereby presenting her life in quilts. And it is this Quilt Legacy page is already something that her family is so pleased with and proud of, and they're able to see all of her creativity and all of her studies about quilt in one place, and it's now preserved.
And many of her quilts have been donated. She had a really nice collection of antique quilts. So now some of them are in the International Quilt Museum, some are in the Smithsonian. And she was a graduate of the University of Nebraska. But now the collection still lives with her on the page. The other thing is there were certain themes in her quilt making. And so we have little galleries that join together some of the quilts. So she had her early quilts, her collection of antique quilts, her feed sack quilts. She made a lot for her husband as gifts. She made a lot for her son, and they shared history. So those are able to also enrich the story. So let's go to resources.
Because you're already starting to talk about some of those in there. Yeah.
Right. So the resources are holdover from the old Quilt Index. And so you're going to get essays, you're going to get galleries and lesson plans, and something new, which are exhibits. And I'm going to go to the exhibits page.
Okay.
Because I think it's something that I'm really excited about, is the opportunity. An exhibit leaves, it gets taken down, and then, whoever sees it again. Now, we had exhibits that traveled, but most exhibits have a time in their life where they no longer go anywhere. And so you can go to the exhibit and you can see what that exhibit was about. Quilts and Human Rights, again, because it's from MSU, I had access to all of the text panels and the information. And so you can see all the quilts that were in that exhibit. And then we also have some videos that were done during the exhibit. And I would really love to see museums let me put their old exhibits up after they've had their closing dates.
But the trick is that the actual quilt itself has to be into the Quilt Index.
Right, and so at the bottom of the page, you see links to where all those quilts are in the Quilt Index. So let's go to ephemera.
And I'll just say that this is the kind of feature that, when I referenced in the beginning of this talk that we've relied on grants, this is that exhibition and the galleries are, the development of that was done under certain grants. For instance, the Institute of Museum and Library Services or the National Endowment for the Humanities. So they've been important for each aspect of development of a new kind of resource within the Quilt Index. Okay, Beth.
So we have uncoverings up until about, I think, 2013 or maybe a little bit longer. And so you can go and you can view all of the articles that are in a particular volume of uncoverings. Now, the other thing you can do, which is something that I think is really cool, is you can go to the publications page. And there's a huge amount of ephemera about quilt making. We have a small part of it, even though it's thousands of pieces in the Quilt Index, but it's the filter by. So if you go to filter by, you can look at just the articles, the batting wrappers, the booklets, the catalogs, but I'm going to go down and look at just the research papers. And what this does now is this puts all of those uncovering papers alphabetical, or you can sort by creator or by the date it was written. So I'm going to go to creator Z to A. And what we're going to find is we're going to find certain authors wrote more than one article for uncoverings. And so if we look at Waldvogel, so we see that Mary Kay wrote, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 articles at least. Are there any up there that I missed? And these are also linked on her legacy page. And these articles are also linked to other quilts. So if a quilt specifically appeared in the uncoverings, I'm working on linking it to the quilts page in the Quilt Index. And it's especially important in uncoverings because the American Quilt Study Group chose not to put any of their images in these articles. So sometimes we can create those missing images by linking it back to the quilt. So again, I'm trying to link up things so that if you go to the Quilt Index, you might fall into a rabbit hole where one thing will lead to another thing will lead to another thing. Miscellaneous, there's some cool things in here. And there are scrapbooks.
Oh, show one special one.
I am going to show one special scrapbook.
Okay, the background is that when I was 16, I inherited my great-grandmother's scrapbook, and she adored the Detroit Tigers, and she was an avid quilt maker, and she was a part of what's called the Detroit News Quilt Club Corner, and so she had photographs of the editor, and yeah, and here's Nancy Brown. So
they made a quilt for Nancy Brown's Carillon.
Yes,
to raise
and
money.
so she, in the Detroit News, she would clip out particularly interesting to her images of our articles and photographs, and there's even she was featured in herself in a couple of the articles. And so for me, this has been a treasure. It was one of the inspirations for me being even interested in quilt research. And I love that now it's digitized.
And there she is, Marsha.
Yeah, there she is. Yeah, my Baba.
Now, if you go to publications and you go to newspaper clippings, those newspaper clippings are going to be in there as well. And we have a huge collection from the Detroit News Quilt Club Corner. They had national quilt shows. They had their own radio show. They had their own cartoon in the newspaper. They had many quilt shows. And one of the donors to the Quilt Index is a lady named Susan Salser. And her grandmother is Mary Gasparic, who's an excellent quilt maker. Really a master quilt maker. And she went to the Santa Monica Library and got all of these microfiche of the Detroit News articles. And so that's something that is going into the Quilt Index.
And we got permission from the Detroit News to do this. And the Salser Family Foundation has been very generous in helping to support the actual labor that it takes to do this kind of digitization and transcription as well, Beth, right?
Right. And so this is an article in the Detroit News about this urn quilt. And hopefully, and if you go down to the bottom, you can see that there's actual urn quilt in the MSU Museum collection, and you can go to that record. So the idea being that we're linking all kinds of things up together. And so this also links to Mary Gasparic, who's Susan Salser's grandmother, and Laura Clark, who made the urn quilts. So I'm really enthused about the ephemera part. Now I want to get to the searches because that's usually the place where everybody's going to go first. So if you hit search, what you're going to get is the quilt search page. But I also want you to notice these other searches. So if you want to look for a particular artist, you can go to the artist search page.
Yeah.
Marsha has made a quilt or two. Now, I don't know why it didn't find.
Well, I see there I am right there.
But you are there, yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, when you go to the searches, if you're looking for something other than quilts, make sure to click on some of these. Now, one of the things that I like in particular is you can narrow down your searches. So remember we saw Lynn Miller's quilt collection as a special collection. Well, she wanted to know if she could look to find just the quilts that she owns that have embroidery on them. So I can click on her collection and then I can click on instruction and see if I can find embroidery. And then go to search and I can see only her quilts that have been embroidered. So the searches are something that we've been working a lot on, and we also welcome input. So if anybody, you know, thinks there's something they'd like to see in the searches that they're not getting, please email me and then we can see if we can do it. Another thing we can do in search is every time you look at a quilt, it has its own ID number, and we call that the KID, the Cora ID number. And you can find it in a number of places. Uh-oh, my internet is unstable. Not the only thing unstable here. So anyway, if you click on this and you get a little preview, you're going to see the KID number there. If you go to the full record, you're going to see the KID number there. Old users of the Quilt Index kept track of things using those KID numbers. And much to their shock and my own, when we moved all of the data from the old version of the Quilt Index to the new version, it renumbered the whole thing. I was not happy. So if you go to the search, and you put a KID number in, it'll bring that quilt up, but it will also work with the old KID numbers. So if you have a list of old KID numbers from the old Quilt Index, you can still use it to search and find your quilt here.
Beth, maybe also you can show the automated citation.
You have to go to the full record and it says cite this quilt, and that gives you the citation.
So for those of you who are publishing, that does it for you.
So how are we doing on time?
I think we're probably due for some questions.
Okay, the last thing I want to say is feel free to search around. You can't break it.
You know, before you take the first question, I just add one more thing. Originally, this was targeted for US quilts. And one of the things that we have aimed to do is expand content globally. And so you can now find the records of the South African Quilt Heritage Project in there. And, you know, down the road, we hope we'll get ones from Australia, Britain, etc., that can help us even answer better questions about dispersion of patterns and fabrics around the world, and maybe many other research questions that you can't answer without having a resource like this. Okay, so now questions. Yeah.
Well, we have quite a few. We've got about 23 questions so far.
Oh
and
my
I
gosh.
imagine more will be pouring in as we start answering some questions. So I want to start with, how does somebody go about it if one of our viewers has a large personal collection of quilts? How does one go about getting their quilts into the Quilt Index? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so join the Quilt Index. Two ways. One thing that I'm working on right now is public submission. So you'll be able to go to a form online and enter the quilts yourself. And then the other is if you have a larger collection and you want more help going through it, then you can be a contributor, like a documentation project or a museum. And so there's an introductory letter here, an application, and how do you figure your work plan. If you go to the contact page.
And while she's finding this, I'll just say that it's not necessarily free to get your materials in. And we, have a sliding scale, but we're, generally speaking, we figure it costs at least $10 a quilt to be entered into this. And that's our guiding principle. And even public submission, when it gets launched, which we hope will be this year, we'll be not billing people, but we will be, entreating people to respect that this does take
Right.
effort and expenses. And in order to constantly keep the technology current as you migrate from one to another system. So it will be much like public radio. We'll be saying, please. And we're going to try that for a while. But
Right.
when we take on large collections, many of these have been added because they've been underwritten by quilt guilds, by state humanities grants, or grants that we collaborate with people on. So.
Right. Yeah, I think that has been one of the biggest, like most asked questions in our Q&A is just how one goes about getting their quilts in this, because really it is a phenomenal resource. It is such a great resource to have moving forward for future generations. In addition to our own,
Yeah, I mean, it's really fun to be able to see, Beth's quilts,
Right.
as she's been quilting for 40 years. What does her quilting look like in the context of a search of, 1980s quilts, and how is it changed or not changed?
Right. And so how would you, can you speak at all to like the, how much diversity in terms of like where these quilts come from? Are most of them American quilts? Are some of them like how much worldwide presence is there?
I can speak to that.
Before we get to that, I want to finish, which is if you go to contact and write something, it comes right to me. And then the other thing I want you to notice is on the frequently asked questions page, you can get links to the documents. So these are the forms that we use. So if you're thinking you want to do this, you might want to print off some forms, document a few quilts yourself and photograph them to get a feel for how much work it's going to be to get these in the Quilt Index. So
that's a great idea.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just say that again at the start, when we started, I mentioned there were 4 institutions. They were all U.S., but they were targeted to be ones that had state documentation records. And yes, it is our goal to still get all of those state documentation records in here, because some of them are at risk. I mean, literally, I think it might have been Mary Kay Waldvogel who said, it's like the boxes under the bed. We feel like if they can get digitized in here, they'll be preserved. And all of those thousands and thousands of hours spent by thousands and thousands of individuals doing the documentation will be recorded and preserved. So then, but I was just going to say, Beth, but then we were calculated in our efforts for building this, that we were sampling like William Smith's collection. So private individuals, ephemera, so each grant we wrote into it, small, large, geographically dispersed. And so you know, incrementally, we were always testing, because this is a research project as well.
Mhm.
So
And
Beth, did you want to?
it usually comes down to one person that knows where the records are and is really dedicated to help us get those records in. It's surprisingly how small a group it is. And a big thing too is now a lot of the records have been housed in libraries and museums and archives, and they're really hard to get to. So then you have to convince the person at the archive that you're not going to be in their way, you're not going to do anything wrong, that you'll just sit there with your little computer and scan and type, really.
You know,
So-
actually right now, we do have some other large collections coming in, and one of them is the Georgia Quilt Documentation Project. And it's nice that not only will it be preserved, and it's being done in collaboration with the Atlanta Historical Center, but the content itself, we just are realizing that there's 600 African-American quilts that were documented there. And so that helps us diversify the content while also preserving records.
Nice. Yeah. We also have quite a few. That was one of the questions was, are there many African-American quilts included in the quilt?
We do have the Women of Color Quilters Network collection in there, and that's under special collections. We
so
did have
I'm going to search. I went to the search page and I'm searching on African American in the ethnic box, and you can see 794.
Wow. That's fantastic. So another question we've got quite a few times was if there's any sort of art quilts or any like smaller wall hanging sized quilts, if there's any sort of, one, if there are art quilts in the index, and if there will be moving forward.
There are art quilts. And one of the things that we well, first of all, I should say some of the state documentation projects had parameters that limited what, even limited by, we're not going to, 1945, we're not going to look at any quilts over, 1945. So in the descriptions of the quilt documentation projects, you have to look for that. Right. I know, I think another state said we are not going to look at any kit quilts. So you have to keep those parameters, limitations in mind as you look at the data.
Right.
And that's usually in the description.
Right.
And Marsha mentioned the Women of Color Quilters Network. And so I went to their page and they have a surprising, most of theirs are art quilts. And so here's a couple of, remember I told you that things link back to Uncovering's articles. So here's a couple of Uncovering articles. But if we go to all the records, you're going to see a lot of art quilts in here because these are the results of exhibits that Carolyn Maslumi has curated and have traveled all over. And in fact, she's got some in Minnesota now that are currently up about George Floyd.
Oh.
So we also have some Sakwa quilts that were donated to the MSU Museum. So they're in there. It was a particular exhibit of very small, I think they're like 10-inch square quilts. So yeah, we do have a lot of art quilts. We don't, part of the problem with searching is, is it a modern quilt? Is it an art quilt? Did you say it in the record? So if we go to search and we just put in art quilt, who knows what will come up?
Right. So you mentioned, as you were talking about that, you mentioned several George Floyd quilts, and Anne had a really great question about, I'm just going to read you her question because I think it's a great one. She says, is there a way to utilize the index to explore how quilts have been used to fight social justice issues, or would it just be by timing of different issues in history? For example, I have read that certain quilts were used on the Underground Railroad, but I am curious about other ways quilts have been used to stand up against injustices. I think that's such a great question. And because you have so much history in the Quilt Index, I think it's particularly applicable to this.
Well, as it turns
out, this collection.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, as it turns out, Beth, myself, and two colleagues at Michigan State University Museum organized a exhibition a number of years ago, and then subsequently wrote a book on quilts in human rights. So it's because we do have that data, and as we worked with quilt makers to ask for their image for use in the book, we also got permission to use it in the Quilt Index. So eventually you'll be seeing all of the images that were in our book will be in here. And so, you know, that's
I want to
one
say a
way.
little bit about this as well.
Mm-hmm.
So again, we're linking to some uncovering articles about that topic. And if we go to view all the records, so a lot of these records and a lot of these quilts were in the book because they were part of the MSU Museum collection. But if I go through and I find a quilt that has the subject of human rights, then I add it to this queue. So you're seeing not just the quilts that we wrote about, but you're seeing any quilts I can find in the index that have to do with quilts and human rights. And again, one of the things I want to start doing is we have a Facebook page, and then going to the Facebook page and saying, hey, I want to add more quilts to this. Will you help me search for quilts in the Quilt Index? You send me that little KID number so that I can then link them up, because I can't possibly do it all alone. And I'm the only one that does this work. And I think it would be fun kind of scavenger hunts. And it could be, you know, all the Laura Wheeler pattern quilts, or I did Marie Webster quilts, all the ones that I could find just by searching. But then, you know, there's going to be quilts in there that you're not going to know because nobody wrote in there, oh, I know this was Marie Webster. I know this has to do with quilts and human rights. But you may be looking through a whole documentation project full of quilts and spot them, even if they weren't ID'd. Well, then I could link them up to that page. So even though the maker didn't know what they had, we can link it to the source.
Right, right. All the crowd started. So you mentioned Laura Wheeler. Laura Lane asked if we can find old clippings of Laura Wheeler or Alice Brooks quilt columns in the Quilt Index.
Not yet. They're waiting in the queue for me to put them in. We had them in the old Quilt Index, but part of the new Quilt Index is that everything that was ephemera had to be completely re-entered in a different style. And so I'm still trying to catch up with those.
Totally.
But we can look to see if we've got any Laura Wheeler. There may be a few in there. The other problem with the old clippings is that we have to get permission for some of them. Right. So we got permission from the Detroit News to put all those microfiche up. So my guess is this doesn't have anything to do with Laura Wheeler, because she wasn't part of the Detroit News. And maybe, now we may find some by searching through the quilts. So this would give us quilts that were from a Laura Wheeler pattern, but not necessarily Laura Wheeler pattern itself. So
I think Sharon has this fantastic question that I want to make sure we ask before our time is up. She says, is there a way people can volunteer? What if a person could volunteer for 4 or 5 hours a week to help with this project? Are you all set up to have volunteers?
The volunteers are through the different documentation projects. So there's volunteers in Wisconsin that are putting in Wisconsin records. There's volunteers in Arizona that are putting in Arizona records. And there's basically, there's a back end where I do most of my work, and it's called Cora. And so if you're
this was a digital repository designed by Matrix.
Okay.
Right. So if you're, and so you can go in to all the different projects and add data in there. And so if you want to volunteer, you might want to find if your project is active and if they need any volunteers.
Okay.
Okay. I don't use volunteers myself. But
one thing that really would be wonderful is for those state documentation projects that are not yet in here, We would love for volunteer groups to, raise money, maybe help, digitize the materials, and then work together to get those in.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's an amazing thing you all are making with this resource. And I think it's going to pay dividends in years and years to come. There's so much history and so much to be learned from this resource. I think many of us watching today's presentation will be spending hours and hours
We hope
exploring the website.
But one of the things we hope is that not only it preserves this data, but that it spawns new lines of inquiry, that that it will precipitate a lot of quilt studies that can be done by many, many people around the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we are all out of time for today, but I want to thank you both so much for being with us today and showing us all about the Quilt Index. I think you are going to have a lot of visitors after today's presentation.
It's great.
I want to put up on my screen one more time our sponsors, because Textile Talks would not be possible without our sponsors. So thank you all for being here, and I hope you have so much fun exploring the Quilt Index. So thank you again, Marsha and Beth.
Bye.
Thank you.